Hello, everybody. My name is Alexander. I'm a team lead in Bloomberg's real-time enterprise data organization. So to start off, this is my first public conference talk. It's very exciting for me, a little bit nervous. Thank you all for attending. Thank you. For some reason, everyone in the room wants to hear me talk about monitoring for about an hour. A little bit less. I know you're all excited. Drinks over across the hall. So I'll be as brief as I can. First thing I'll say is that nothing here is gospel or set in stone. There's a lot of gray area. There are many exceptions to be made. In fact, you might disagree with something that I say. That's okay. If you do actually, please come talk to me afterwards here at the reception, at the Bloomberg booth, tomorrow, in the hallway, Slack, anything. Carrier pigeons is fine too. So my team at Bloomberg builds observability and monitoring tools for market data systems. And recently, past few years, we completed a re-architecture of the client-facing metrics and monitoring system that provides metrics to our users. So this process inspired a lot of this talk. The end result looks a little bit like this. We'll get to that later. So let me set some expectations right off the bat. This is not Metrics 101. I'm not going to answer how to monitor your brand new web app. Or walk through any specific tools or stacks. But I am going to talk about system-level architecture, design, and product decisions that you may encounter along the way. Everything will be as tool and platform agnostic as possible. My goal here is that regardless of your specific tool set, stack, et cetera, you can take something away from here and apply it back at home. So why? Why do we want to do this? We're talking about taking special internal data that you collect and sharing it with people outside of your team, outside of your org, maybe even outside of your company. I think this probably seems wrong at first to many of you. That's not unusual. It's probably most engineers, most teams' first reaction. You want to be protective. You want to keep everything to yourself. So why would you want to do this? You might have an idea because you've chosen to come sit here, but I'll walk through some scenarios. I'm going to say that you own a platform, and I've written an amazing application. Perfect. And I'm going to use your service to host it. So I take my binary, my container, what have you, ship it off to your service, and I hope for the best, right? Maybe not. Maybe I want to check in. I want to know, how is my service working? I might ask, how much memory is it using? That would be nice to know as a developer, right? Well, can I find out the answer, or do I get crickets back? What if it's using too much memory? Does it crash? If my application crashes, do I find out? Maybe you display an error message. That's something. I could probably work with that. Now I know, and I could fix it. But it might be better if I could see the usage beforehand and do something about it before it crashes. It might be even more better if I could set an alert on it and be proactively warned. Maybe this isn't a running application, but it's a video, and you have a hosting platform that hosts videos for people. I might want to know how many views my video is getting. You can take this same diagram, replace application with video, memory with views, and the memory error with no views. The concepts here are broadly applicable. They're not just for infrastructure or video views or anything in between. So another scenario. I have a multi-instance, multi-server application running all over the world, and I'm hitting your API. You have some quotas. Well, how much of my quota am I using? How much am I using by region? How much am I using in aggregate? You might already have this data. You probably do for metering, right? So why don't you tell me before I hit the limit and my service starts failing, or before you send me a nasty bill at the end of the month because I've used more than I expected? So back to why. Why do we want to do this? Because number one, your clients want to monitor the resources that they control. All the situations I just described are ones where I, as the client, am sharing control over something that I wrote and I own, but only you have visibility into. Applications, containers, VMs, access rates, videos, it doesn't matter. These are all things where I'm trusting you with some level of ownership over the future performance. In some situations, your clients, your users might demand this. Maybe they'll refuse to do business with you if you don't give them this data. It could be regulatory, health, financial data. It could just be mission critical to their business. Maybe it's neither of those, and they just don't want that surprise bill at the end of the month. Finally, providing this transparency can reduce load on your support teams. If I, as the client, can self-service and diagnose and fix a problem, you might never hear about it. And if I can do that and fix a problem faster than if I had to call you, that's going to make me a happier customer. The goal here is to provide a better service to our users, to our clients, right? OK. So we agree. We want to share our data. Prerequisites. I'm going to assume for the rest of this that you have some metrics, metering data, et cetera, and you have it stored somewhere accessible. At Bloomberg, we write code that looks something like this. We have, there we go. We have a name, a value, some tags that let us filter and search later on. The details aren't too important. You probably have something similar. And I'm going to assume you have users, or maybe you hope to someday. As a note, they don't have to be external paying customers, just users. You might be at a large company that provides a managed service internally to other teams. These concepts all still apply there. OK, prerequisites out of the way. We understand why we want to do this. How do we actually give these clients, these users who want visibility, how do we give them our data? Option 1, we don't. Or not the data itself. We don't need metrics. We don't need graphs. We'll put up status boards. We don't need to show fine detail. We'll just say whether things are working. If everything is fine, we can say that. And when it isn't fine, we'll say that as well. Really, this talk is about providing visibility, not just metrics. If the visibility your users need is not the granular information, maybe this is OK. Maybe you're not really in one of those complicated scenarios I started with. Ideally, we pair this with context on outages. When something goes wrong, we say, we're on it. When it's back to normal, we tell people we fixed it. Providing postmortems, extra transparency helps here as well. There is some wiggle room. Maybe we could put up the quota percentage we talked about before. Sure, that could work. It doesn't have to all be binary, OK, bad. We could even make these client specific, where each client has access to a special board for them if you really wanted to. It's a lot more work, and I don't know that I'd recommend it, but it's an option there. Finally, you're probably all familiar with something that looks like this. This one's made up, but maybe you've seen this one before. GitHub, Slack, AWS. I think many services have something like this. So to summarize, these are a great option if you can use them. There's a reason all those services you're familiar with already do. The broad visibility that it provides meet a lot of needs. It's also the most opinionated option available. You get to decide what good, bad, degraded, or any other state you want means. And exactly how much you show is up to you. It is, however, less helpful for situations that are not fully managed, where client behavior can easily impact performance and change the values of these. Those are some of the scenarios we talked about at the top. Application memory is a good example. But it is one of the easier solutions, and I think it's a great first choice or default option if you're starting down this path. So we might like this in this room, but like we said, many users won't. If it doesn't work for them, they're going to say they need more, they need the granular data, they need metrics. What do we do then? Well, we said we already have the data stored, and we have users that want it, so hand it over, as is. I'm going to call this direct access. You probably have something like this on your internal network, or maybe privileged for your team. Again, the numbers here don't matter, but it's a dashboard. Well, we go in and we change some DNS, some proxy settings, some permissioning. Poof. Now it's an external dashboard. This has some real benefits. It's very low effort. We change some configs, and we're done. It's also dog fooding, for what that's worth. So we're using the exact same tools, the exact same data, as our users are. You will always see the same values, the same dashboards, as they do. You should never hear, well, it looks fine on our end, I can't reproduce it, right? There are some real downsides, though. Maybe one day you want to change the tags, the labels, the way that you filter and store your data. Or you want to change the data representation itself. So here we go from %free to %used. Related concept, but you like one over the other for some reason. Normally this is fine. You push out the change and you change it. You control the publishing, you're the only consumer. You don't need to talk to anyone else. But now you can't do that. You've made your internal implementation also your public contract. So you can't make backwards incompatible changes, like the ones I just mentioned, without consulting a much broader audience. Right? Maybe you can't make those changes at all, even if you wanted to. A worse problem. What about all the skeletons in your closet? Scary tech debt. Maybe we don't really want our clients knowing that we track things based on legacy client ID tag v2. We're totally going to migrate away next quarter, maybe next year. It's in the backlog. We're going to get to it, right? It also doesn't work if you have proprietary and sensitive data. This is made up, contrived example, but we have a made-up client. We're going to call them Bloomberg. And we see they have activity in their Tokyo location. And around 5 p.m., it spikes up. Maybe this reveals something about that client and their usage that we don't want to share. Bloomberg has this problem. Our metrics, our data, our tags, they could reveal trading patterns, trading strategies of our clients, and we're obviously very concerned about keeping that information private and secure and only available to the people who need to see it. So that's a lot of negatives. Is it even worth it to consider this as an option? Maybe. I think for a certain type of users or data or platforms, these limitations are really okay. And you can save a lot of time, a lot of headache by going down this path. Internal teams is a great example. If you can more easily work with them on changes, and you can probably trust them with your skeletons, your secrets, so you don't need to go through any extra effort. In fact, I'd say this is probably the default approach you should look at if you're trying to provide this to your internal managed services. Okay, so we can open up existing data. Maybe we don't like that option for one reason or another, but we do need granular data. The dashboards don't work for us. What's our third option? Produce new metrics. Just for this one particular use case, whatever specific user needs we have, we'll add new metrics for that thing. I'm going to call this bespoke metrics. So let's forget about all the old stuff we had stored somewhere. Don't care about that. We'll start with a blank slate. Clean, new set of metrics. We can focus on exactly what you or your clients want shared rather than any of the internal needs of the component teams. Maybe we want a different name for the same thing. Here we have messages sent changed to message sent. Go ahead, add in a new line of code. Maybe we don't like the legacy ID. We want to use something else. The component team still wants the legacy one, though. We'll just add them both. That's fine. Maybe the client prefers seeing average, and you use percentiles. Or the representation we talked about before, %free versus %busy. Doesn't matter, add them all. This can work. It does allow you to separate the work from your component teams. So whoever's building this system doesn't really need to talk to them. The monitoring you build can be dedicated for this particular use case. And you have no reliance on the existing systems, existing tools, existing paradigms of the old metrics. But you do have to source all of this data, right? And that might mean modifying someone else's code. It might mean duplicating a pull from some shared unified source, procstat for OS metrics, something like that. That takes time, that takes effort. That means you have your developers going and putting up pull requests, working with other teams potentially even to change their code. Worse, you now have two systems, and they might not agree. I promise that if you leave this running long enough, at some point, they will diverge. Maybe on one metric or one resource, but it'll happen. And debugging those is not fun. Trust me. So overall, I don't really recommend this, but it is an option. We should remember it's in the toolbox if we need it. I'll also add that I think this is maybe the natural first thought that many teams would have. Maybe not the way that I've phrased it here, but when you're asked to provide a feature or a product, you go build it. Especially if you're separate from the component teams. Why would you go talk to them and just start building what you need now? So it's not the worst option, but again, I try to avoid it. OK, we don't like the direct access, and we don't like bespoke metrics. I have one more option for you. We're going to go back to this. We're going to remove the separate collection path. Remember, we already have data stored somewhere that's useful enough. We're just going to siphon off just what we need, just for this use case. We'll add an adapter that can process any of the data that we need to. And then we'll send that over for external access. So kind of somewhere in between the other two options, right? We'll call it indirect access. The main difference here is that adapter I mentioned, right? So what does the adapter do? Well, let's consider that one component that's using the awful legacy tag. It's in the backlog. Remember, we're going to get to it. And they also report by device ID and type. But we have another component from a different team, and they use the new tag. They've already migrated. And they just use host for a similar concept to device. Not exactly the same, but close. Well, we can pipe them both into our adapter, and then we can report whatever public interface we want. So maybe what we want to provide is client ID and resource ID. We can do even better. We can add in extra information that our consumers might want that the component teams don't care about. Maybe location and a nice human-readable name is something that our consumers would like to see. But again, those component teams, they don't care. This has the effect of sanitizing and transforming the existing data. So it hides the skeletons that concerned us with direct access. It's also pretty close to the dogfooding we got with direct access. It's the same source, just slightly different output. This doesn't fully remove the possibility that your results can deviate, but it does decrease the risk. But it is more limiting than separate data. You're now dependent on those existing metrics and the needs of your internal users. Remember, it's still the same source. So you might have to be flexible and make some exceptions here. And overall, I think it's a level of effort that's somewhere in between direct and bespoke. So, summarizing. Number one, dashboards. Use this if you can, where the granular data isn't necessary. Then we go to direct access, which is great for internal, trusted teams. And it's probably pretty easy, but not always suitable. Bespoke metrics, we'll try to avoid those unless we really need them. And indirect access for when you can't do the other ones. So we know how we want to share our metrics. And let's assume we have that nice big data store available with everything you want to collect. But what information do you actually want to share? This could probably be a whole talk on its own, and it frankly isn't specific to the idea of external sharing of metrics, but I'm going to give you a few tips. First thought, everything. We've got a big data store. People want to see what's in it. We'll share it all. No, in my opinion, or at least probably not. I will suggest that it is highly likely you have far more information stored than your users really need to see. There are probably going to be many metrics, indicators, and in fact, entire subsystems that only make sense to the people or the teams with the appropriate context and background knowledge. It is tempting and easy to throw everything in, but don't do this. As a rule of thumb, exclusion is your default mode. Start with nothing, no metrics. Selectively choose what you want to add in. Don't provide more than is necessary, because everything you add needs to be supported forever, or close enough to forever. Here, avoid saying, well, it might be useful, or could be useful someday. I hear this a lot. I think it's probably the go-to reason I hear when I tell people we're not adding something. And it's tough, but avoid it. Also remember that once you release something, it is very hard to take that feature away later. It is much easier to find a need later and add it in if you do need it. Also keep in mind the 80-20 principle. I think it applies here. It's possible that 20% of your metrics, 20% of your data, provide 80% of the utility in terms of debugging, triage, et cetera, to your users. If that's the case, maybe we should just show the 20%. We don't need the other 80. It is OK if occasionally those exceptional cases come up and your clients need to escalate to you, the vendor, for a weird or an uncommon issue. The thing to keep in mind here is that our goal is not to make our clients stop bothering us. It's to provide them with a better service and a better experience overall and a better product. So if they can come to you with useful information and they can do that quickly and that helps you solve their problem faster, that's a big win, even though you still had to be involved. Don't think that just because you received a ticket, you received a phone call, you received a page, that the system has failed. It hasn't. So it's tempting to throw the kitchen sink in and be done, but you will set yourself up for trouble later on. Remember, exclusion as default. Let's look at this example. We've got detailed CPU information on the left. System, user time, interrupts. Wow. That's all we could ever hope for, right? It's all we need. It lets us do all of our own monitoring, observability, triage. It's great. But if you've been asked to provide your users with the answer to, is my CPU busy? It's probably a common question. Do they need to see all this? Or can we show them a summary? Does telling them idle as 1% answer their question? Yeah, it's basically the same information, right? Flipped around, but simplified. But Alexander, it might be useful someday, I hear you shout out. And I think it probably won't be. And if it is, you can always add it in later. So if we agree to be selective in what we share, how do we decide what we should share? What should be included? To do so, I recommend focusing on meaningful and actionable data and asking yourself these questions. First, can the user do something with the information you're providing? And second, can it indicate a real problem? Can it indicate an actual thing that's happening? Or can it indicate anything at all? Tanner Lund's talk yesterday on incident pattern analysis, he mentions this concept as well. I do recommend going back and looking at it if you didn't get to see it. I think it goes to my point here that these are broadly applicable ideas, not just for this particular topic. So, by example, is this actionable? I'm a client. I'm experiencing a problem. If I can't change your API response time, that's what's on the left, and I have no control over your internal queue size, which is on the right, do I need to see this? Or am I going to see it, see red, think, that's bad, and call your support line? If that's the case, consider whether it makes sense to show this, or should we just put up a degraded banner, like we talked about at the beginning? Here's an exception where maybe it does make sense. Imagine that the queue is unique to me as the client, and I can actually do something that changing my behavior to reduce usage. If it only impacts me, it doesn't impact anyone else, and I can fix it myself, then maybe it is useful. But also consider if the representation is what you want. Maybe in that case, a quota with a percentage would be more useful than an exact number. The point here is that context matters. So maybe we know that this is normally bad, but not at noon on Thursdays or every second Tuesday of the month. But how would our users know that? You might say that this is actionable because to you, you can take action. But if the users can't, they don't need to see it. Remember that. The second point, is it meaningful? Does the data help the user know something new, or is it only useful in combination with other internal data? That's the context I was just talking about. Ooh, we can see here this line drop down to 25K. That could be bad, or it might not be. So what? Clients will call you, I promise, asking you why their flux capacitor load is too low, even though everything that they're doing, everything is working just fine, and they don't experience any real problems. But they'll call you and say, well, it's usually at 50%. Now it's at 10%. Something must be wrong. Remember here that, again, context matters. So This might be useful to one person on one team, but it might not mean anything to someone else. Consider that before you release this data. This idea of context can also apply at multiple levels. My point here is not just to say you should have everything internal and then make a tiny subset external. Maybe the component team that owns this useless data, it's useful for them. And maybe your clients don't need to see it. Maybe your support teams do, maybe they don't. Think about what they could use. You could have 3, 4, 5 different tiers that provide different context to different people with different levels of privilege. Again, we probably let our support teams see a little bit more information than we want external people to see. As a final note on this, I will admit that sometimes doing this, excluding metrics that someone has specifically asked for, is really hard. It might be useful. Remember, they're going to come shouting that. So I'm sure this isn't new to anyone here, but clients, product, other teams, users, they're always going to want more. They just heard about that secret flux capacitor load number, and they knew that it was really useful in the last outage, and your team looked at it and it helped them, helped you solve the problem. So you should just share it with them, right, so that they can look at it next time. Maybe not. Remember, meaningful and actionable. Your job here, when this comes up, is to convince them that they're wrong and they don't really want that data. Again, I understand it is hard. It is hard to do this. Some tips to help with that. Number 1, ask, what does this add compared to what is already available? You might already have something that's close enough and solves their need. Think percent free versus percent busy that we talked about a few times. If not, maybe you don't. Okay, that's a novel request for some new information. But again, meaningful and actionable. What incidents would this actually have avoided had it been available? Seriously, ask whoever's sending you this request, ask them, can you point to an instance where had this feature existed, things would have gone better? Hopefully they can. And if so, okay, it might be useful. But number 3, how often does that happen? If it happens once a year, is it worth supporting this forever? Maybe it just happened for the first time last month. Should we support it forever? Remember here that it is okay if some queries sometimes have to come back to you or your support teams. I can't give you a concrete rule here. I'm not going to say that, oh, if something happens, once in 6 months, it's worth it or it's not. It depends on severity. It depends on your level of tolerance. I think this is probably different for something in health or a rocket engine compared to grocery delivery. So I can't give you a rule of thumb here, but you have to gauge it for yourself. Okay, so I've gone over why, how, what of a system like this for sharing your monitoring data. And I hope that everyone in this room maybe has an idea now of what it could look like for you back at home. But I'll talk a little bit about what it looks like for me and my team at Bloomberg. All right, this is a very high-level view of Bloomberg's system. Bloomberg has a lot of data. I think people usually think of things like stock prices, but there's many other things too. There's news, reference data, bond pricing, all sorts, and we're happy to talk about it more back at the booth. For us, an enterprise client is someone who wants to access that data in a programmatic or an automated way. So the data starts and it's generated up at the left, comes through a data center, and then we have a global distribution network in the middle that gets everything where it needs to go. On the right is the area that we're most concerned about. This is where our clients are writing various applications, and those applications will connect to our platform and consume data. So in the simplest case, you can imagine a trading bot subscribes to the price of Apple and maybe some news and sentiment about Apple, and it makes decisions, and it makes them lots of money. That's the part that we care about here. And that has the shared ownership features that I mentioned all the way at the beginning. Clients are writing things that they own, that they depend on, and they need information that only we can provide. So as an example, how many bytes is one application pushing and pulling through the Bloomberg platform? How much is it pushing and pulling in aggregate by region, by location, by server? Also, we provide co-located, dedicated hardware that we put around the world and give to clients. Well, they want to know what the load on that hardware is. Again, only we have access, but it's in their data center. So my team owns a system that answers all of those questions. To that end, we provide about 200 metrics on various resources. I'll show you some examples that clients care about. We send about 1 billion data points a day. We peak around 1 million a minute. And we distribute everything via dashboards and UIs, and also via some live time series streams. So you can actually write an application that subscribes to live pricing data and subscribes to the performance of itself and does something with that. So what method do we use? You probably can guess based on the way I phrased the methods before, but indirect access, mostly. There are a few exceptions. We have a few pieces that you might put under bespoke, and I'll talk about them in a second. So this is a simplified view of my team's system. Walking through the steps, on the left we have sourcing and ingestion. So there's various component teams. I'll zoom in here. Again, individual pieces aren't super important, but we have routers and servers and applications. And they all provide metrics into a central Bloomberg metrics platform. You can think of Prometheus, but it's based on open source components, and we use it widely at Bloomberg. If you'd like to know more about it, come talk to us. We're happy to discuss. So then my team can subscribe to all the streams that we care about. Remember, we take that little filtered offshoot via one single interface. But importantly, these are the same metrics that the component teams see and use for themselves for all of their own purposes. So before we move on to the right, I said there were some exceptions, right? Some places where we use bespoke. Well, this component here actually looks kind of like this. And we have some special APIs and unpacking for application metrics that help us get that data into that central system. There's a few specific Bloomberg reasons why we can't, but one of the easiest to explain is that we get one big report from a host that has applications connecting to it, and it tells us about all the applications it knows about. So this is a push model. But again, this is all the applications across all clients. We have to take that, break it up, and aggregate by individual applications. Then we generate metrics from those, and we send them on to that central platform. This is happening across thousands of hosts all over the world. And the way that the system works is that many hosts actually see information from the same application. So we have to aggregate both by application from one host and also by application globally and send it onto that central platform. So why does this need to be bespoke? Well, the applications here and really the platform that's hosting them, they don't think about metrics the same way that we want to. When you only have a big report and the contents maybe don't map directly to the metric you want to see, you have to do something in the middle to convert. That's the bespoke nature of this. A good example for us is connection count. The reporting component here doesn't track that directly, but they log information about the connections that happen. So we get that in a report, and we count them up. And we have to do that in a way, we have to be a little bit careful so we don't get duplicates. And we turn that into a numerical time series. There can and will be other things like this that we run into, and you will too. The point here is not to dive deep into this particular exception. The point is that there will be exceptions. You need to be flexible. You need to be able to adapt and adjust to make the system work. You can't set out to say, we're using this method and that's it. Okay. We now have everything in our central store. So then my team processes and augments. That's this box in the middle. This is the adapter that I talked about earlier in indirect metrics. This is actually a distributed system. There's multiple components, but let's just think of it as one box for now. So we take all the data points as they come in. Some are internal only, or they're otherwise unimportant to clients. But for one reason or another, we can't exclude them upstream. So we drop them. But most things we receive, we're sending them on. Here's where we might modify a name or convert from bytes to kilobytes, something like that. Importantly, for almost everything, we are augmenting the data. We're adding extra fields that only matter for the external interface. The result of this is that our clients have one common language across the entire Bloomberg system that they can use to consume metrics. And the individual component teams can use their own language for their own systems. And they don't need to really care about each other. My team bridges the gap. So finally, we've processed everything and we've cleaned it up. Now we publish and distribute it. We use Kafka, and it goes out to our web UI and our streaming API, which is consumable by clients. The streaming API, imagine it's Kafka. It's actually a Bloomberg-specific technology for our clients. Again, you can talk to us more about it if you have questions. So I can't really show you the API streams. It would be a boring string of bytes or something, but here's the UI. Looks a little bit like this. I'll zoom in for the people in the back. So at the top, we have different resources with a status. So see, this is where we're being flexible. A little bit of a nod to the status board option. Everything's obviously perfect all of the time, but I assure you that if something did go wrong, which it never does, you would see a little orange or a red square up there. And we can see individual metric views. Here we see free memory for a machine, and on the left we have a little summary of the most recent value for some of the metrics. If we click that Get More Details button, we can dive in, and we can see things like subscription counts. There's a whole host of other metrics. Like I said, there's about 200 we offer across a variety of resources. We also offer open events. This is a little bit of a nod towards, again, the dashboard option. If something goes wrong, tell people about it. So I'm happy to talk more about this if anyone has any questions later on, but I think this is a good overview. So if I can leave you with some key points. Number one, share your data. Metrics, telemetry, what have you, don't hide it. It might be scary, but I promise that doing so is worth it. It will provide a better experience for you and your users. Two, choose how you share that data carefully. Make sure you're matching the method with your needs. Dashboards, direct, indirect, bespoke. Maybe there's something else that I didn't mention here that you think about that makes sense for you and your team. Just make sure it matches with your real needs, because once you pick something, you might be stuck with it for a while. Third, be intentional about what is shared. Don't throw everything in and be done. Don't throw the kitchen sink in. Remember, exclusion is your default. Start with nothing. And focus on meaningful and actionable. Fight. Fight against it might be useful someday. Thank you. As my final note, we are hiring. You can come talk to us at the booth. I'm hiring too. If you want to move to New York, you can come work for me if you want to work on this system. Thank you.